Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're having ourselves another Orchid Seminar. It is the second episode of this new series we started, and today's topic has to do with watering orchids, when we need to water orchids, and many other subjects related to this. Now first, before we start, let me mention that this is not a tutorial. We're not going to talk about how to water orchids, but if you're a beginner and you're interested in watering tips, I do have a video for you guys for Phalaenopsis. You'll find the link in an info card on the top right corner of your screen. It will always be there throughout this video, but I'll also share it down below in the description. Today's video is more of a demonstrative discussion, and it's not necessarily meant for beginners. So if that sounds interesting to you, let's just start with, when do we actually need to water these orchids? Now, the most accurate answer to this question is orchids should be watered when they need it. But it doesn't really help us much because we don't know when orchids need water. And furthermore, not all orchids need water at the same time. So because it is a rather complicated answer, you will find simplified versions in beginner articles, such as water every 7 days, every 3 days, every day, every month. Who knows what other intervals are given by authors. And to be fully honest, none of these intervals are correct because they don't take into account any details. No environmental conditions, no medium, no type of orchid, nothing. So we're gonna stay as far as possible from saying orchids need to be watered every X amount of days. A slightly incomplete but much more correct way of describing when you should water your orchid is saying you should water it whenever it is dry. Because generally, the moment orchid roots dry coincides with the moment they could actually use a drink or accept a drink. But more than that, there are many benefits in watering orchids when the medium is as dry as possible. And being that drying of the medium is different for each and every one of us, we cannot talk about an X amount of days. There are many things that influence drying of the medium, but we'll get to that. So first, let's see why it is actually beneficial to let our orchid pot dry. First of all, most of the orchids we can grow easily at home are epiphytes. I'll link you down below to an article that explains what an epiphytic plant is, so you learn more. But generally speaking, epiphytic plants are more adapted to withstand drought than terrestrial plants. Of course, some orchids are more drought tolerant than others. It has to do with the environment in which they are found. But even with more water-loving orchids such as a Miltoniopsis, you will discover that generally they are more drought tolerant than a tomato plant, for example. So given this tolerance to drought from the get-go, we generally can, if we want, let epiphytic orchids completely dry out without having bad effects on the plants. Is it actually beneficial for the plants? Well, indirectly. What it is more beneficial for is the medium. In the case of organic media such as bark, sphagnum moss, coconut husk, and other materials widely used with orchids, giving the medium breaks from being too soggy actually prolongs its life. The wetter organic media sits, the faster it degrades and the faster we need to intervene and repot the orchid. In wet environments, microorganisms, including pathogens, have a much more prolific life. By letting the medium dry out, we keep under control this colony of potential pathogens, bacteria, and other microorganisms. Not all of them will be bad, but some of them will indeed affect orchid roots, because fungal spores and bacteria and other things that directly attack orchids thrive in water as well. Bottom line, letting the medium dry reduces the chance that pathogens will over-multiply in our medium and will start to affect the orchid. But not only that, through breaking down, the medium starts to lose its integrity, it starts to lose its shape, and air pockets start to disappear as the medium crumbles and becomes fine. This leads to less oxygen for the roots and, in extreme cases, the suffocation of the roots. By limiting the times in which the medium is wet, we are postponing this degradation. Not all media is organic and prone to degradation though. However, all media is prone to having air pockets filled with water. Drying out, at least to some extent, makes sure that the air pockets are emptied of water and filled with oxygen yet again. Depending on the size of the pockets, keeping medium always wet can actually keep those air pockets filled with water, and the outcome is the same: roots can get suffocated. This will of course depend on the size of the medium, the materials, and things of the sorts. There are cases in which always wet medium is absolutely no problem for the orchid. There are environments which are not prone to certain pathogens that affect orchids. But again, we're talking about context here, and it's hard to determine who among us is prone to what type of orchid ailment and when. So when talking about orchid advice, we do generalize slightly just to try and maintain as many people safe as possible. As I was saying, there are orchids which simply do better in more water-retentive media. This doesn't mean they're not drought tolerant, but it means that they do get stressed and don't perform as well in more droughty environments. For these types of orchids, of course, we are using a more water-retentive medium, and we try to aerate it as much as possible. But generally speaking, these types of orchids will be repotted more often and will be more prone to having, let's say, humidity-related issues. Thus, the subject of root aeration for these orchids is a little bit more important than, let's say, for a cattleya in very chunky medium. But even these orchids are subject to the influence of the environment. In warmer, drier environments, obviously, issues with pathogens are not as common maybe as in other environments which are more humid or cooler. So it's hard to say for every one of us when we need to water orchids in order to avoid problems but maintain the orchid healthy as well. But to try and summarize it within a general idea, when your orchid gets completely dry or as dry as it can handle, it's then when you should water, and this will only bring benefits. But as I was saying, many of us need to balance this availability of moisture with the medium and with its tendency to degrade in very high humidity. So when deciding when to water, we also rely on the storage capabilities of the orchid. So let's talk a little bit about that. Being that most of the most popular orchids we grow are coming from environments in which they don't have access to water all the time, particularly since they don't grow in soils, most of them have developed very ingenious ways of storing or conserving water. First is the rate of growth. Orchids generally grow much slower than any other houseplant or vegetable. A tomato plant can grow 100 times faster than an orchid, or even more. Well, this growth needs to be sustained with resources, and one of the main resources growth is sustained with is water. So a tomato plant will need much more water than an orchid. By limiting its growth to a certain speed, the orchid limits its requirements of water within a certain time frame. Next, let's take a look at the roots. Generally speaking, orchids have thicker roots than many other terrestrial plants. Again, the example of the tomato. But actually, what you see here is not the actual root. It is a protective layer called a velamen, which absorbs water and retains it for a while for the root inside to absorb. Now, I don't want to break a perfectly good root, so I'm going to demonstrate on this dried root. What you see here, the outer coating, is the velamen which dried. But inside the velamen, if we open it, we are going to find the actual root, which is this. And this looks much more familiar. It looks more like the tomato root. So because water is scarce and it's not available for long periods of time, the velamen makes sure that it absorbs it fast and it holds it there for the root to absorb in its own time. Another drought adaptation is the cuticle present on the leaf. P.S. Down below in the description, I will add more links that explain cuticles, respiration, and all of these plant terms that I'm mentioning. So if you don't know something, just check the description. I'm just gonna give very simple explanations. The cuticle is a membrane that protects the leaf from pathogens, but also it maintains water inside the leaf much better than other plants with thinner cuticles. As you might know, plants breathe, they exchange gas, but with this respiration, water is lost in the process as well, through the stomatas underneath, but also through the epidermis. For plants with thin cuticles, water loss is much greater than in plants with thick cuticles, which protect against water loss. And even though water loss through respiration is unavoidable, orchids have yet another ace up their sleeves. Epiphytic plants, including orchids, which come from dry environments, also have adapted their way of photosynthesis. Researchers have discovered that some orchids are actually absorbing CO2 during nighttime, not daytime. They still photosynthesize in the presence of light, but they store that CO2 and use it in daytime when they have access to light. The most efficient CO2 absorption happens through the stomata found on the underside of the leaf. During daytime, they are closed, but in nighttime, they open, perform the gas exchange, and lose water. The lower the temperatures, the higher the humidity, the lower the water loss as well. So this is a very fascinating adaptation that epiphytic plants in general have, and it would appear that many orchids, such as the cattleyas, even the phalaenopsis, they actually exchange gases during nighttime, and this is referred to as the CAM pathway photosynthesis. Again, links down below to more articles. And some orchids have specialized structures which retain water in the forms of pseudobulbs, canes, depending on the orchid. And as you might already know, when the orchid is lacking water, it taps into its reserve, which is located in the pseudobulb, and leads to pseudobulb wrinkling. It doesn't mean the orchid is sick, it means it's just accessing its water reserves. Not all orchids have pseudobulbs, but all orchids can store water within their structures for a certain amount of time. Also, not all orchids appear to make the gas exchange during nighttime, and of course, not all are as tolerant to drought. It really depends on variety, but overall and generally speaking, most orchids are much better adapted to withstanding drought than many other terrestrial plants. So generally speaking, watering orchids when they're dry or almost approaching dryness is not harming them or stressing them. When an orchid doesn't have any more water available, it will tap into its reserves. For oncidiums and other orchids which have pseudobulbs or other storage devices, well, these devices will visibly shrivel. You will see that the orchid is using up all that water and moisture stored. At this point though, still the orchid is not in danger. It is using those resources, yes, but if we water it at this point, the resources will get replenished, the orchid will have water to grow, and everything will be like it never happened. That is the role of the storage device. Phalaenopsis orchids and other orchids which don't have pseudobulbs or canes will store their water in their leaves. So when they tap into their reserves, the first thing that's going to happen is the leaves will not be as perky. They will be softer, maybe a little droopy, but still at this point we didn't reach the critical line, and if we water the orchid, the leaves will perk up like nothing ever happened. If water continues to not be provided, the orchid will continue to use the stored water until it's depleted. In case of oncidiums, the pseudobulbs will be so thin and shriveled like a raisin, and in case of phalaenopsis and other non-pseudobulb orchids, the leaves will be wrinkly, droopy, such as you see here. Now, this is the critical point because this is where the orchid will have to make some adjustments. And to understand what type of adjustments, we need to understand why it's utilizing water. Part of it is used to produce new structures, new leaves, new roots, and part of it is used in maintaining the already formed structures, such as the roots and the existing leaves. Just because they don't grow anymore doesn't mean they don't need resources. So the orchid will prioritize the newer growth over the older growth all of the time. Because the older a structure is on the plant, the more chances it has to be damaged, be ripped, and not perform well. Hence, the orchid will start to give up the old structures, old leaves, old pseudobulbs, even old roots. It will do that in an attempt to conserve water and direct it to new growth, new roots, and even new leaves. So this is the first line of defense for an orchid, giving up older growths just to preserve water. The more water is withheld, the more structures will be given up. Starting from the oldest leaves to the newest leaves, one by one they will all be shed. Also, roots might start to be shed as well. They will start to desiccate, and again, slowly, one by one, they will wither off. As much as this is a saving technique for the orchid, it is also a compromise. Each structure wasn't just staying there consuming resources, it was producing something. Leaves were photosynthesizing and producing food. Roots were absorbing water and nutrients. The less leaves and roots we have, the less energy overall the orchid will have and will be able to collect and produce. A little side note here, when dealing with sick orchids, many people make the mistake to start cutting off leaves. That is absolutely wrong. The orchid is the only one who can decide how many leaves it needs to shed to be in proportion with its root system. Sometimes you will have an orchid which can handle all of its leaves with not too many roots, as long as you maintain the water stable. So starting to cut leaves just because they transpire is a big mistake, because you are depriving the orchid of photosynthesis or photosynthesis opportunities. Also, there is a very high chance that sick orchids are limiting their respiration rate anyway, so they're not losing as much water as a perfectly healthy orchid. There appear to be some experiments or studies, which I will try to find and add them down below in the description for you, that suggest that when an orchid and other plants is under stress of dehydration, the stomatas are actually not working at full capacity. They're actually maintained more shut than usual, so that the water loss is not as great. The metabolism appears to be decreased as well, and usually these plants will focus their energy into producing structures which can actually absorb water. If this is the case, then a stressed and dehydrated orchid will adapt its breathing so that it will not lose as much water as a healthy orchid, because the water resources are limited and need to be replenished first. In the worst case scenario, the orchid is already super dehydrated, with all of its reserves depleted and with all of the roots absolutely gone. Case in which chances of recovery are very minimal. So the idea is not to reach this state, but to offer water before the orchid starts to tap into its reserves. If something happens to your orchid while it is already dehydrated, recovery will be much longer, if possible at all. One of the episodes in the Orchid Care series that I made here on my channel, sponsored by Repot Me, dealt with a bunch of very sick and dehydrated orchids. You'll have the link shared down below and in the info card. These are the orchids that I picked, and I purchased these more than 2 months ago in a very poor state. And I picked 3 which were in various, let's say, degrees of stress. They were all limpy and leathery, but this one looked the best, this one so, and this one looked the worst. The more stressed the orchid is, the slower the recovery is as well. So this one was looking the best, and as it turns out, it is doing the best. It is even starting to produce another flower spike there. So with this one, it's almost like it didn't happen at all. Next one is this orchid, very limpy, but not incredibly stressed. Again, the recovery is very fast. We can see roots starting to grow everywhere. It's not like it never happened. Probably this leaf will be tinier, but it still looks very decent. This, on the other hand, was at the limit, and I took a big risk when I purchased it. I announced it in the video, and I announced that I will make it better within a month. Thankfully, things worked out for me. They could have easily taken a turn for the worse, and all of my series that I planned could have just gone to waste. I had to rely on my ability to spot what orchid is on the edge but not over the edge. This was very close to the edge, and you can see in that video how bad she looked. As a result, it is the one that still looks the worst. We lost all of the initial roots, all of these, they're dried, I can remove them. We have new roots, but we don't have flower spikes. This leaf will be incredibly tiny. This leaf cannot be saved. It is damaged beyond repair, because through dehydration, not only the resources will disappear, but also the actual tissue will get so damaged that it will not be able to repair itself. So you can see a very clear difference between them. And that has all been done by dehydration. But things don't always turn out okay. Sometimes orchids might actually be very weak. They might not be vigorous hybrids. They might have underlying issues which start to affect them when they get very stressed. It is never ever a good idea to stress orchids this much. Not even how this one was, because you don't know how they will react. As each time the orchid will tap a little bit too much into its resources, it will get stressed. And when the orchids are stressed, metabolism decreases, respiration, photosynthesis, all of the other things start to decrease as well. Growth is a little bit impaired, and overall, the orchid needs to start fighting to survive and allocate its energy however it knows best. And that is not overall okay in the long-term life of an orchid, in my opinion. I wanted to address this as well in this video because I recently got a comment from one of my viewers saying they found an article in which a grower subjected their Phalaenopsis to many days of drought until leaves started to fall. And the conclusion was, well, orchids are very drought tolerant. Now, excuse my language, but I think this is the dumbest experiment that I've ever heard of, because all the articles tell you that orchids are adapted to drought. And we all know that they can tolerate quite a lot of time without water. However, how much time depends on many things. One orchid can tolerate one single week without water before it starts to get really stressed. Other orchids can tolerate a month or 2 or 3 or 4 without water before getting stressed. A Phalaenopsis for a person can tolerate 2 weeks, while others can tolerate 4 months. It really depends on the orchid, environment, structures of the orchid, medium, and so on and so forth. There is no amount of time the orchid is able to survive without water. And furthermore, when structures start to fall, we are beyond the point of tolerating drought. We are at the point of getting very stressed and having to give up structures in order to survive. But bottom line, the fact that orchids are drought tolerant doesn't mean that they will be okay when they are not watered for a prolonged amount of times. But anyway, back to our story. Sorry once again, there are things that do trigger me as well, and that was one of them. When I don't see the purpose of an experiment with such drastic outcomes, I get slightly upset. Anyway, so what are the factors that actually influence when we need to water our orchids? Well, we talked about the type of orchid we have. Oncidiums, Masdevallias, Cattleyas, Vandas, Phalaenopsis, they are all very different orchids coming from very different types of environments. So they've adapted to withstand drought differently and have different care requirements. However, that is not the only factor that influences water frequency. The second very big factor is the medium we choose to use. Bark, even coconut husk, charcoal, leca, and other not very water-retentive media will have the tendency to dry out faster, since they themselves don't really retain all that much water. On the other hand, media such as sphagnum moss and other materials which hold tremendous amounts of water will tend to dry out slower. However, in conjunction with this, we need to consider the setup, the pot, what type of growing conditions we have. We might have an orchid which is mounted and has a little bit of sphagnum moss around the roots. Well, that orchid can actually dry out within a few hours, even if it has a water-retentive medium attached to it, simply because it is so exposed to air and so little moss is actually used that water evaporates very freely. Depending on their environment, lifestyle, and capabilities, each grower can actually opt for a mixture of a water-retentive medium with an open basket, or vice versa, a non-water-retentive medium with a pot which can retain that water a little longer. It is really a personal choice, and each grower can decide which works out a little better for him. But of course, the setup and medium can influence how fast your orchid dries out. If your orchid dries out within a day or 2, then yes, theoretically you should water it more often. If it stays wet for 5-6 days, then you don't have to water it as often. Also, the amount in which an orchid stays wet can work in some environments. For example, in dry environments, orchids can stay wet all of the time without the fear of pathogens multiplying or damaging the roots, because the environment itself, being dry, simply doesn't hold pathogens as much in the air as a more humid or cooler environment. And again, we're talking about specific locations around the globe. For some people, things like powdery mildew are very common in certain seasons. For other people, powdery mildew doesn't even exist. I personally never saw it, ever, here. But it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just not very prone in my particular location. It might be prone further up in the mountains, but you can see how exact location can actually make a difference in how often you water your orchid. The changes in season can actually influence your growing space. So maybe in summertime and springtime, you are forced to water more often than in winter or fall. For some people, this doesn't really matter because they might grow their orchids in their house and they have central heating, so it's kind of vice versa. Maybe due to the dry air, in winter they actually require more water. So there isn't a rule we can imply there, and it also has to do with what type of orchid you have. If it's a very big orchid with a lot of roots, it will tend to drink more water to sustain itself. Also, if we're having an orchid which has a dormancy period, it will not drink water evenly throughout the year. It will barely drink anything during its dormancy times. An orchid which is in bloom will typically require a little bit more water than if it's not in bloom. If it's not growing leaves and roots at the same time, it might not. In the case of catasetums, when they're in bloom, they don't necessarily require much more water because they're done growing. That's a little side note. So again, it's very, very dependent on the type of orchid, their age, the season, if they have flowers or not, if they have keikis or not. There are many, many instances that will dictate how often you water your orchid. So you could set yourself a schedule of every 5 days, which can work for a few months, but then the orchid starts to produce a keiki and you will notice it's getting dry every 4 days, not 5 days anymore. What should you do? Well, you can actually adjust the watering regime. Nobody says that you have to have a strict schedule. There are many things that will influence your schedule. Growth of the orchid in comparison to the pot. Again, you will start with a pot which will be able to retain water for a week, but within a year it might prove to be too small for the size of the root system and you will need to water more frequent. So it's so variable that I really cannot make up a rule for everybody. But by saying that orchids should be watered when they are dry or as dry as they can tolerate, then I think I can cover most of these instances. And to end this subject, you will notice as a viewer that many YouTubers, blog posters, Facebook posters, we all do have different opinions and have different tactics and different culture techniques and so on and so forth. And that's great. But you have to always remember something. Sources that provide free of charge information on YouTube, Facebook, and the entire internet are not filtered by any entity or organization. There is no person coming to me and saying, this information is good, this is false, post this, don't post that. No, it's up to me to filter this information and provide what I believe is true and what I believe is correct. But at the end of the day, these are my opinions, as are the other people on YouTube's opinions or Facebook or blog posts. So I do want you all to take all of this information under consideration and filter it yourself. Go and research more. Some of us provide additional links, some of us don't. So it is a really great idea to verify and search and filter all of this information you read and hear through your own filters, and don't take it as it is. Just because somebody makes a video in which they have a big hyperbole in the title doesn't mean it's actually true. And there is such a thing as clickbait, and there is such a thing as views and ad revenue. So keep those things in mind, research, or at least think about things logically, and then try to make a decision. And with that, I will end the subject. I hope you have a great weekend and I hope you found this interesting. And you know the drill, like or dislike this video below, subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, seminars, African violet videos. And if you wish to support the channel further, do consider visiting the merch store down below. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!